Sorry, I'm just checking the time to make sure I know when we're supposed to stop. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here this afternoon. And I am delighted to be here with Raqib Shaw and Zehra Jumabhoy for this panel. Do we have a pointer for the slideshow? But for me to control the images. Okay, thank you. So. Thanks very much. Okay. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. All right. So we are here to present the panel Paradise Lost, Mughals, Mirrors, and Memories of Kashmir. And we are delighted to have Raqib with us, who is an artist of Kashmiri origin, who's going to be speaking about his work with us. Zehra and I both came to Raqib's work in different avenues. I actually came to it through Zehra because we teach a course together at the Courtauld on Mughal art and how modern and contemporary South Asian artists look back to it. And one of the artists that Zehra references in our course was Raqib. And so I first was exposed to his work in 2017 when we ran our course, and very happily for me, that was the same year there was an exhibition at the Whitworth in Manchester, which I went specifically to see Raqib's work. And Zehra came to his work at a 2006 exhibition at the White Cube here in London, and it was something which just immediately grabbed her. And so both of us, we saw the works. I felt an immediate connection with them and an immediate resonance with them. And we're absolutely delighted when this year we were able to meet Raqib and take our students to his studio, actually. Kashmir has such a resonance in and throughout Raqib's works. And that was also the case for the Mughals. And Jahangir is famously said to have quoted about Kashmir that if there is paradise on earth, it is this, it is this, it is this. And I think that for those of you who have been to Kashmir, to parts of Kashmir, it is a place which has just this immense beauty and natural beauty, and it captures you. And it's a place where if you have had an experience of being and staying and have a history there, as Raqib does, again, it's something which resonates continuously. And this is something we're going to explore with Raqib through his work. One of the other important aspects of Kashmir, which again will be brought out in Raqib's paintings, is the fact that in a way it's a microcosm for historically an exceptionally important space for a syncretic society. And there were, obviously it has a very long Muslim past, but also it has a very strong Hindu past and Buddhist past. And it was a place where different religions and different elements of society came together and lived together and existed together. Less so today, unfortunately. So what I would like is to just share a few ideas about Raqib's work, and then I'm going to ask him to speak a little bit about how he came to London and his experiences here. But within and throughout his paintings, there's this idea of representing cultural memory and challenging and experiencing how to portray a sense of belonging as well as a sense of displacement. And one of the fascinating things about Raqib's background and approach to his work is that he draws not only from his own heritage, but very much from a European heritage as well, European heritage of painting as well, which will come through. And these are just some of the details of the painting that we just saw. One of the things which I found completely fascinating about his works, as does Zehra, is the fact that you look at them from a distance, and there is this beauty that pulls you in. These are shiny works, they're enameled, there's gold, they're very, very striking. And then you get drawn in, and you look, and there is this element of fantasy, but also of the grotesque. And it's this incredible combination which comes through in the finished works, and what really, really pulls one in. So, Raqib, what I would like to do is start with asking you to just tell a little bit about your background, about growing up in Delhi and Kashmir, and then coming to London, and how your experiences then here have combined with your past experiences to start us on the journey that you began with your own work.
Well, I grew up in, I was in Kashmir for 17 years, and this was, I think, 1988 and 89, and that's when the political scenario just went crazy, and it was not the kind of Kashmir that I remembered when I was growing up, because it was an incredibly secular place, and it was also a place where when Afghanistan was a center of learning, all the people with thoughts that sort of, maybe uncomfortable thoughts would flee to Kashmir, where it would be closed for 6 months of the year, so they could do their own. A Sufi sect it was in Kashmir, and then there was also Hinduism, and it was, the birthplace of the Vedas, and so it was a completely different Kashmir. And then in 1989, 88, 89, it was the big, that was the year that things changed. And I remember that I went for my, I think it was, they're called matriculation examinations, and I had really, really worked hard for 3 years, and I was extremely determined that I would get the first position. And I remember the day we went to the examination center, and there were kids with Kalashnikovs and guns on the table, and they told the examiners to get out. And so that was a bit disheartening. So I left, and I went to New Delhi. And my mother wanted me to be a doctor, and I absolutely hated the idea, but I still did suffer in New Delhi for 2 years, and it was very, very terrible, and especially the heat. And then my uncle, who is the head of the family, he said, you won't be able to earn much money as a doctor, so why don't you... well, he basically sent me for a Mickey Mouse course to London for a year in a terrible, terrible college. It doesn't exist anymore. And and it was then that, and of course I was, like everyone else, destined to be... to go into the family business, because, Asian families, that's what they do. Everyone joins the family business. And, but it was in 1990, I think it was 1991 or 1992 that I came to London for the first time. And I went to the National Gallery, and I saw the wonderful Ambassador's painting by Holbein. And what I thought is that it's a very, very good idea to not be the merchant, but be someone who can actually paint the merchants. Right. And I quite like the fact that it has that wonderful anamorphic skull, and there's always that memento mori. And I thought that painting would not be a bad idea to dedicate one's life to art. But then, of course, I did work for my family for about 5 years.
Do you want to see what the business was, so that we can come back to the...
They used to sell carpets, antiques, jewels, and blah-de-blah. And I was, of course, my first job was as a window decorator, and then I was working in the graphic department, and then, I did tell them that I do not want to go into sales, but then I found myself in sales, and I absolutely hated it, and I was working in South Audley Street, and selling carpets and shawls and jewels, and I did that for 5 years, and then I thought that I really couldn't do it anymore, because selling is just, it's just very, very boring. And then, of course, I told my family that I was going to, that I did not want to study, and I wanted to study. I did not have an education. I wanted to do at least a bachelor's degree, because, that part of the world, there's great sense of, there's not much self-worth if you don't have a degree. So everyone has to have a degree, see.
Yeah.
So I wanted to study art, and then I told my family that I want to study art, and then they said fine, and I came here to study art in 1998 with £875 in my suitcase, and I found a studio. It was Hackney Wick, Percy Dalton's peanut factory.
Yeah.
And I decided to live in the peanut factory, and there was no heating, there was no, the sink was a mile away, the toilets were like 2 miles away, absolutely infested with vermin and disease. It was very, very romantic. I had a fabulous time. And I used to have my shower in a baby's paddling pool. I did that for about 5 years, BA and MA. And then on the last day of my MA show, Glenn Scott Wright from Victoria Miro Gallery, he was interested in the art, and then back in the days, Peter Doig used to live in Trinidad, and he was extremely kind enough to give me his studio in I think, Mike Auber Street for 3 years.
Yeah.
So,
so that's how you started.
Yeah. So, Raqib, what you were just saying about your time at St. Martin's and the lack of funds that you had, that played into your process and the types of materials that you were using.
It was an extremely interesting time, 1998, and of course the reason why I decided to go to St. Martin's, because I had this romantic notion that it's next to Old Compton Street, and back then Old Compton Street was not gentrified. All sorts of eccentrics used to live there. It had a real subculture of its own. It was really, really exciting, and because those days, painting was usually Chelsea. Chelsea was where you would do all the experimentation, and then, of course, Slade. But St. Martin's really wasn't a painting college, and of course, painters were considered dinosaurs, and we had a tiny little painting group of people, and they were all, many of them were middle-aged, which was that made the problem even worse. Many of them could not climb stairs because they were too old, so it was, and all the young people were doing installation and video, and so it was generally considered that painting is dead. And I remember the very first seminar I had at St. Martin's was called From Smashed Crockery to Elephant Dung. And it was about material and the language of the material. And I always wanted to find my own material and so that I could make my own language. Oil paint I could not compete with because, it's impossible. And so I went to Leyland SDM, in Shaftesbury Avenue, because that's where the hardware store, because I could not afford oil paints because they were very, very expensive. And so that's when I started experimenting with Hammerite. And the whole idea was that it all started with the idea that what do I do with this material, so that it, in a way, turns into something else, as a bit of alchemy, I would say.
So you were using a combination of enamels and metallic industrial paint.
Yes.
Or the materials that you could.
Yeah, and then I used to I used to manipulate them with little toothpicks and the porcupine quill was much later. It was one of my lovely American clients. She's not with us anymore, and she was in Botswana, and outside her tent she saw a porcupine had shed its quills, and she sent me some, and they're really fabulous because they give you a lot of control, and they're very light, and well, and you can get quite a lot of fabulous detail with them.
But Raqib, the other thing being, when did you start using jewels and Swarovski and
that was college days, I think, because it was.
So you were too poor for paint, but then you had Swarovski and some emeralds.
Let's not forget that it was back in the day, Swarovski, they were very, very expensive. So yes, they were expensive things to make.
Yeah.
But then,
So one of the, if we look at the details from some of your, from some of the paintings, you can see that there's a three-dimensional quality to Raqib's works. Can you tell us a little bit about how you achieve that in the use of the, is it acrylic to make the gold well?
Basically what happens is, if Mehreen, if you go further, so we can see the process. So what basically happens is that first it's, like this was a painting after Cranach, which was shown at the Scottish National Gallery, and it was shown with the original Cranach painting. And it starts with a photo shoot and then transferred onto paper there, and then onto acetate, and then composed on the painting with an overhead projector. So I can get the depth and the perspective and whatever is needed. And then the drawing is, there's the acrylic filler, which is used to amend stained glass. It's water-based, and they, in a way, they create these little cofferdams, and then paint is poured in and manipulated with the porcupine quill to get the desired shade effect, or chiaroscuro, or whatever it is.
Okay, wonderful. So that is what we see here.
Yeah.
Here are some of the unfilled
Yeah.
wells which have been created using that technique, and then you can
Yeah.
see how it's how you get that really wonderful visual effect to the finished works.
So almost like a sort of jewel-like quality.
Zehra, my
which
dear,
is
an
how
absolute.
we-
And the whole idea, it's, if you look at the very, very early paintings and you look at the latest ones, I would say that it's 21 years of working with the material and not letting it go.
Yeah.
So you really see that over years, the painting technique has become more and more sophisticated, I think. And because the whole idea is that, you know, they do look like oil paintings on print. And there's something very uncomfortable about them, I think. Because they're on that edge of you know, good and bad taste. It's on the edge of that kitsch, and they really don't fall into it, I think. So I would say that they're not as you know, you can't really call it tacky Bollywood.
No, I would not call it tacky Bollywood.
Expensive Bollywood.
Expensive Bollywood, yeah.
And this again is a wonderful painting, because it was fabulous to be in St. Martin's, because the National Gallery and the National Portrait Gallery are just, you know, so close to the college. And this is one of my favorite paintings from the National Gallery. And almost using this painting as an experiment to see how the medium and how the technique can have a conversation with, I think, one of the finest paintings in the National Gallery. And of course, there's all the symbolism, and they're all coded messages, and they have a lot to do with mortality, loss, greed, human society, and yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering that the three art world nasties, you call them,
we cannot talk about them, my darling.
Oh, we can't talk about them.
But they are people. They do exist, and because you know, life is a theatre, and I like to document this theatre from my point of view. And I think that it's in a way it becomes I think a statement on or an observation on the condition of man and people in society, and you know, and they're all pages of a sketchbook almost, or pages of a diary. So with every painting, I know exactly what was going on at that particular moment in time in my life. But also, apart from that, of course, they have to work as paintings, and all the formal issues that one deals with as far as paintings are concerned. I think that it has been, you know, it is a continuing long journey, but I think that they are getting somewhere.
I was also wondering if you want to decode it a little bit, particularly since we are talking about Kashmir with some references to that.
What I decided, this theatre is at the bottom of a hill where all my ancestors are buried, and I think that I'm going to be the only one who's not going to be buried there, because I'm going to be cremated. I don't want to waste space. And that's a lovely, wonderful, again, an example of what Kashmir used to be. At the top you have the Hari Parvat, and at the bottom you have the Sufi shrine. So you can see that back then it really was religions side by side and living in harmony. And it was in Kashmir there used to be the Kashmiri Pandits, who would be the teachers, and there would be the people the learned people, and then there would be the Muslims who would be merchants. So they were all taught by Hindu professors, and it was, I think, in 1989, that because of the political problem, that the Kashmiri Pandits had to leave Kashmir. And as a result, there was quite a bit of a void left in the culture, and I think that it'll never be the same again, especially with the problems now.
So this, one of the really fascinating things which I mentioned at the beginning is this interest that you have in not only the, India, Kashmir, South Asia, and that coming through in your work, but also your admiration of European painting, in particular Renaissance painting.
Yes.
And there's this series of paintings that you did which are obviously based on Renaissance originals, but then you take them and you manipulate your own imagery in order to portray issues relating to your own concepts of cultural
they almost become theatre sets. So I think that and of course always an excuse to see that what is it like to paint marble in this material, and this is a rather lovely painting. Although I think that the torso is out of proportion, and the lovely lady has legs of a very, very old man. But you can see this, and you can see this lovely alcove. Of course, and you can see this lovely alcove, and of course in the background you can see the transition from the ideal paradise that Kashmir was, and then what it has become now.
Yeah.
And of course,
just on that note, Raqib, so when you mentioned the Holbein painting, the ambassadors, the Holbein painting at the National Gallery, you've said previously that one of the things that you really admired about that painting was the fact that every item that Holbein chose to represent was chosen for a specific reason, had a symbolic meaning, had a certain resonance which meant something in the painting. And that's something which you also have incorporated into your work. And so with this particular painting, I wonder if we look at some of the details, if you can tell us why in particular you chose them for this painting, and if it was the idea of moving and representing your notion of Kashmir as a paradise that was, and moving to the idea of it becoming more hellish in terms of obviously the imagery that you created, but then relating that to Kashmir, because you haven't been back in 21 years. And you've said in the past that you've placed yourself in a self-imposed exile from Kashmir, and you don't envision going back. So I would imagine that there's a sense of not only longing but loss.
And also, and in a way, I think these paintings do become. I think they do become cathartic. I think in that sense that they do. It's I would imagine a part of the healing process. And yes, they do. It's as I said. These are. It's my way of documenting my experiences and what's happening now.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the specifics of the myth and how you're using it here? And I just also wondered, given that we've sort of been to Raqib's amazing studio, which is like sort of a slice of the Himalayas, you said. Yeah, it's a little bubble, and it's got these amazing...
Well, you need a lot of imagination.
And many elements of his paintings are actually in the studio. So what was so amazing was that the sort of where fiction sort of bleeds into the reality, and then you actually quote
the boundaries between reality and fantasy are blurred, my dear.
Right.
Yes.
And as they say, reality, whose reality is it?
And yes, it's I have the most fabulous studio team, and that have been with me for years, and I love them very, very deeply. And the studio is an absolute temple. It's very, very much like a proper Renaissance atelier, and we only believe in art and aesthetics, and we do not waste our time on absolutely anything else. Domestic ideas and domestic way of living is banned, and we don't do any of those things, and and people don't get angry over little things, and they don't make issues. So it's only about aesthetics and how to push the practice further and to question, because what I want to see is where does this all everything comes to an end, and I'm really interested to see what happens to these paintings. Do they implode? Do they explode? Where do they go next? I mean, it'd be very, very interesting that in a few years' time, if I start painting abstract paintings, you never know.
Yeah.
Oh no, I hope
So there's Tombly-esque things.
move on to the next one.
Oops. Stuck.
Oh, it'll happen. There we go.
Oh, this is
So
gorgeous.
when this painting was of particular interest to me when I saw it for the first time, just very recently this summer, because as a Mughal specialist and focusing on architecture, it was just so incredibly striking to me to see the spaces that Raqib chose to represent in this painting. And it's an amalgamation of architectural forms that you find, ubiquitously used in Mughal architecture, but also forts, from Rajasthan. The idea of the floating palace in Amer. And one of the other things which I've noticed throughout your paintings is also a continued presence of the mountains, which I relate back to that Kashmiri landscape. And in this particular painting, it was really fascinating to see your process of how it was put together, because there's so many different, not only architectural elements, but decorative elements which are used in it. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that, how you put your paintings together.
I think this is this painting is. I think it took me about. It's the first painting that actually engages with architecture of that part of the world, and I had to wait all these years because I never wanted to be this kind of, this Kashmiri or Indian painter or Kashmiri painter. I wanted to be a painter, and I wanted to be a painter, sort of a world painter. I did not want to be sort of, So I did, consciously stay away from, pastiches of these maraccas and that kind of. So I did stay away from it. But this one was absolutely fascinating. It was a lovely commission, and I thought that, I could just go crazy. And what's really fascinating about this painting is that the architectural elements, they don't really exist. They're all hybrids, and it's an amalgamation of Mughal and Rajasthan, Mughal, and Persian architecture, and it was extremely. It was fun putting it all together because these spaces, they do feel that they exist, that they're convincing, but in reality they really don't exist. And I think it does. It has a sort of a clockwise narrative, this painting. So. Yeah, it has a lot going on. I mean, it'll take a long time if we start going into each and every single detail. But yes, it's that amalgamation of these three different types of architecture, and of course with a Renaissance perspective, with a wonderful nod to Ludwig of Bavaria, the Moon King.
Yeah.
So one of the processes through which you go through in terms of putting the paintings together, because with that particular painting which you see on the top now, you look at the architectural spaces and you identify them as particular sites, but then when you look at them closely, they're not. And so you do a lot of research in terms of the creation.
Well, I always believe that, as they say, plagiarize, that's why God gave us eyes. So, so it's a very, very good idea. So, it's lovely to take elements and then, very gently, I hate to use the word, but, bastardize them a bit and then make them my own. And so you have everything around me is up for grabs, and you can steal as much as you want to, and which I think is going to be quite sort of a normal thing as the world becomes smaller and as people have a lot of influences, and I'm sure that you have these hybrid works. I think it's.
I mean, what's so interesting about your works is how the more you do, the more you seem to quote from yourself as well.
Yes.
So, like, if we sort of look closely at that image, there are always references to Raqib's other works within that. So each work is almost like a little retrospective in itself.
Yeah.
And I find that really, really fascinating. So it's not just hybrid with external things, but even like internally, your own sort of dialogue you borrow and quote from.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay
yeah,
in
this is amazing.
Yeah, this is quite a wonderful one. So I'm going to read a quote that you gave for the Whitworth exhibition in 2017. You said that coming from a family of Kashmiri traders, I was constantly surrounded by beautiful objects, opulent carpets, and jewels. And you spoke about how the past influences you had fed into your work, and then obviously you've combined those with, as we've already said, the European imagery that you were looking at and adapting as well. And this particular one is the self-portrait in your study in Peckham in the Kashmir version. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about some of the, if you can pull out just a few examples of past history for you and past influences which you put very purposefully into this painting.
Well, of course, this painting is based on a rather small but very, very beautiful painting at the National Gallery, and it was, well, of course, it's sort of a psychological self-portrait with all the objects from my past, and you have the food. And then, of course, there is that little bit of irony as well, that you have the mice eating the food, because it's almost as if this figure is surrounded by, let's say, opulence, but he really is, in a world of his own, and I don't think that he really cares about much what's going on. And yet you see, again, that's autumn in Kashmir, and then you have that shrine burning was I think, quite. It was a very, very sad scenario, because my grandfather he used to take me there all the time, and his family, they still were, the keepers of the shrine, as to say, and so it was very sad when it got burned down, which I think was arson. But it's again, the paintings are about, that things keep on changing all the time, and that's why we can't really take anything for granted, because everything is in constant flux, and things can be fabulous one minute, and the other minute, it can all go haywire and tits up or down.
So one of the things which I find really quite interesting, and I think that certainly all three of us will have felt that, and I think anybody who's either, immigrated or first or second generation immigrant as well, you feel a sense of cultural displacement.
Yes.
For my part, my parents are Pakistani. I've never lived there, but I've been going since I was a child. And my concept of being Pakistani is what they instilled in me. And when I went, I thought I was Pakistani. But you learn quickly that when you're there, you're not.
Absolutely.
And then when you're here
you are.
or like I grew up in the US, it wasn't until I got to university that I recognized this sense of displacement and being a bit, I wasn't quite sure how to deal with it. And I remember making a project for my photography class where I did, it was around this idea, and it was the first time I consciously addressed it myself. And one of the things which I did was took a photograph of myself in Western clothes, talking to a photograph of myself wearing a shalwar kameez. And it was a dialogue, or what I was trying to portray was a dialogue between these two parts of myself, which I was, for the first time, trying to separate but merge. And I feel that you have this incredible way of dealing with this question of cultural displacement in the paintings. And I wonder if you want to just say.
Well, also, Mary, it's
that.
like as I think it was Longfellow, wasn't it? The leaves of memory make a mournful rustling in the dark. So they are sort of mournful rustlings of the leaves of memory, I think. Which I think one day, I don't know, I might get over it, and I might start painting fruits.
I hope you never do that.
Yeah.
Please never do that.
But it's also true that, it seems like the earlier work had, you could see your little self-portraits in there, but it was less obvious, whereas now, a lot of them,
I think
you've appeared.
I hate to use the word. I think it's maturity, is it? Oh, one reaches maturity. Of course,
Eventually.
Of course, when I first started in college, and it was that fabulous hedonistic time when you're young, and what was it called? The blood is hot, and then of course
I wonder if that's what drew you to Kranich, because his works have this
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, it was when I first, the Cranach at the National Gallery, and I remember that when I did my, do we have an image of it, the first Cranach painting?
I think if we go all the way.
And it was,
I'll get there. It's a bit slow.
so it's good to see that the first Cranach, and after all these years, you see the latest one. So I think it's I think they're developing rather well.
I promise I'll get there. Come on. The previous one?
Yeah, the first one.
Yeah.
One more.
This one.
So that was the first one. Of course, what I loved about the Cranach one at the National Gallery is that, of course, it's a sort of a biblical story. But then, of course, she's wearing the fashion of the day, and I quite like the fact that Cranach made it very, very contemporary. So it's and it was when I finished this painting, I remember, and I was going to the laundrette on Roman Road, that I thought to myself, well, you know what? I have a feeling that I might be able to make a living out of this damn thing, because I think I found something, and the paintings might succeed. So it was that leaf that I did that I thought that, well, I might have found something. And yeah, so that's a special painting. And of course, I was Chris Wainwright, who was the Dean of St. Martin's, and he's, he passed away last year. He was extremely, extremely kind and generous towards me, and he gave me my first commissions. And this work is owned by the London Institute, because they have a museum, London Institute Museum or something.
Okay. And then the last series of paintings.
Oh yes, the Four
If you
Seasons.
could,
Yeah.
so these are a very set of very recent works that Raqib has done, the Four Seasons, and I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about.
Well,
the
it's of course
concept behind them.
it's a narrative. It's not only 4 seasons; it's the 4 stages of one's life. And of course, over there you see the Kindle boy reading a book in an absolute idyllic scenario, and you have a little and a lovely fairy story book, and then there's a little snake there, just as a little reminder of what's going to happen. And then of course this is youth, the fabulous burning youth, and you have this Icarus kind of a figure. Of course, a sweet little nod to our dearest Lord Leighton, of course. And then, so of course, this figure is, of course, there is music, there is a drink, and of course, the fabulous, you can't really see them, the fabulous clouds that are gathering at the top, that are a little reminder of what is to follow.
Is that a Blake reference, I wondered?
No.
The little clouds, no.
No. And that, of course, you have the autumn, and again you have the bubbles of youth and childhood, and of course there's the figure there, which is me when I'm going to be like 65 years old if I live that long. And then of course there is the winter painting, which is my absolute favorite painting, because this is not only do the bodies based on, I did quite a lot of sculptures, and not only are the bodies based on, they sort of remind you of Bernini and Giambologna, but I think that this is a lovely homage to my most favorite Caspar David Friedrich, and I really do love the way that this tree absolutely slices the composition in the middle. And of course you have 2 sides here. One is, if one would say, it's that moment of if one dies a natural death, you have 2 ways. One is if you've had a terrible life, and that is what fear, you just fear. And the other one is that if you've had a fairly okay life, you just understand that it's a mere cycle, and things just die and whatever. And then of course you see that little storybook that that's sort of the result. I mean, the final consequence of the little boy. So yes, ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
But there's a narcissus that blooms.
Oh yes, it's the whole cycle. You see, it's from the bud all the way up. It's a pity you can't see it properly. So it's the whole cycle, and I think basically we should just shut up, keep going on, and try to look at the bright side, I suppose.
Lessons for life. Are there any questions for Raqib? Yeah.
I was wondering about the kind of play on the Renaissance paintings, and obviously given that the Renaissance was almost triggered by the Pakistani and Arab Renaissance that happening, I was wondering if there's a kind of resistance to the lack of representation that happens in the European Renaissance, or whether there's a kind of round circle that happens that brings it back to the kind of from that, and then it comes to Europe, and then it comes back round to, or whether it's just a kind of you placing your own, like, what's your relationship with the European Renaissance when it comes to the fusion of the two cultures? Does that make sense?
Sorry,
Sorry,
can you make it a bit more succinct, the question, please.
Where's the question in that?
Well, I'm wondering what's the relation, how do you place the relationship between the kind of Kashmir and Pakistani histories and cultures that are fused into, in relation to the pre-European Renaissance that happened in Pakistan and...
I'm sorry, there wasn't a Pakistan.
Oh, is it? Oh, no, I know. I'm talking about the region and the area as opposed to, like, the board.
In terms of national identity?
No, in terms of, like, there was the Arab and the, what's it called? Islamic Renaissance, okay.
So what do you mean by that when you say a pre-European Renaissance in Pakistan?
Well, I mean, so say, for example, in around the Arab regions, but then also leading into Northern Asia, there was the Renaissance that came before the European Renaissance. And I was wondering if where there was a revitalization of the classics and things like that, hence why they were brought back into European histories. And I was wondering if there's a kind of, like, if there's a round circle, or whether there's kind of...
Do you mean there's a sort of forgetting in terms of how Western European art is developed in terms of the Renaissance, that they don't acknowledge what might have led up to it? Is that what you mean? The non-West that might have had, is that the question?
Yeah, that, and then the kind of injection of your own culture into them.
Well, I think there's always that osmosis. I think that you know, I do reference Eastern and Western culture, and I think, well, does it sort of? Am I correct? Do you mean does it all sort of go in a circle? Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I guess it must. Yeah, I guess so.
In a way, it's
in sort of in a strange way, I think. Yeah.
And also, it's all your heritage. Is that also the point? I mean, whether or not you're looking at Ludwig and Dreaming of the Mountains.
It's also identifying oneself with different scenarios and different people, like Ludwig.
Like Ludwig. There was one.
Ludwig had a question.
Thank you very much for what's a very interesting insight, and I think it's a lot of credit to the conveners to link that through. So thank you. I'm a great admirer of your work, and what's been very interesting to me always is the level of layering, a kind of layering in terms of a cross narrative, a kind of layering in terms of the jewel-like quality, which again was a challenge you mentioned. People were doing video art, and here you were going into enameling, and just that filigree.
And let's not forget the dangerous D word, decoration.
Indeed.
Yeah.
You know,
so here there was a little bit of surrealism, memory, craft, and decoration that's kind of amalgamated into what I think is a very poignant statement of its time in terms of a kind of caustic mixture of
I'm so glad that you think so. I'm so glad that you think so, because you know it's very, very easy for many people, and I had to face this all the time. You know, to say, oh, it's a pretty painting, it's decorative art, and blah blah. It's as if you know just put it in a little box, and then you just solve the problem. But no, they are very, very layered, and I think that it is, you know, it's a certain kind of aesthetic, and I think that it is an aesthetic that I think that I have developed over the years, and I think that it does speak to that kind of, you know, it does have that Eastern and sort of Western melange, I guess.
So in fact, my question is that there seems to be quite a sharp tension between terror and beauty.
Oh yes, because you see, they have to exist on that that level, and it can't be. So they're not really pretty paintings. They're quite grim, but then at the same time, when you that's why I think that people need to engage with the paintings. The more you engage with the paintings, the more the paintings reveal themselves to you, and I think that the more the viewer is rewarded. It's very, very sad that nowadays that people. I mean, there must be like 3% of the people who actually have an attention span to look at a painting for more than 1 minute. It's really, really sad. And I'm also talking about people who are used to looking at art, and it's people just have a very, very short memory span. I mean, attention span nowadays. So it's and these paintings, you need. Once a collector told me that the only person who can really understand my paintings are the people who actually live with them, because every day they look at the painting and they find something new. Which used to happen a lot in the Earthly Delight series.
And the last bit is the biographical element there of you beginning to appear in them. Is that to do with trauma of memory, or is that to do with something which is the poignancy of the times we live in?
Both.
Right.
I think. And also I think that the older I get, the more I realize that, it's excuse my language, you just think that, oh, fuck everything, just do what you want to do. And don't really care. I really do believe that, it was wonderful. Woody Allen said when he was 75 years old that he only has one regret in life, that he wished that he didn't care about what people said or thought about him. That's the only regret he had, and I think it's a very, very good thing. Oh, well.
Just a quick announcement before you leave here. The last session of the day is going to be in this theatre.